Civility is a great example of new thinking in art, art as a social practice, emphasizing collaboration, going beyond conventional genres and formats of art making. So I wanted this to be an opportunity for you to talk with him about how he's developed his thinking about art, how he got a sense of the art project, what he's trying to do here on campus, and what his thoughts are for you as the next generation of artists. So I'll turn the floor over to Bill.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So first, I'd like to thank Elizabeth and everyone here from Lewis College for bringing me out and for allowing me to collaborate with some of your peers on this project and use this space to just have some fun and investigate local history. One of the things I always do, and we always should do, is when we travel, kind of pay attention to the people's land we are on, and of course, here in southwestern Colorado, this is traditional Ute land, as well as other Native people. So always be cognizant of where you're at. So I'd like to thank the Ute people for using the land or being here today. So I guess I'll introduce myself and then talk a little bit about my work. I wanted to show a 16-minute video and then kind of open it up for some conversation, okay? I don't know how these usually work, but hopefully that's appropriate. I came up kind of as a printmaker, so I brought some prints. There's really only going to be a small amount of prints in the show, so if you're interested in my print work, I can talk about that and show you some of those. So I'm an artist. I was born and raised in Michigan. My dad's family are Métis, which are kind of Native peoples in the Great Lakes and in Western Canada. I grew up in a rural area and kind of have always been interested in radical histories and radical politics and the ways that art and those sorts of things fit together. I hopped around at university, taking 5.5 or 6 years to graduate, switching my major multiple times, and ended up realizing that for me as an artist, it was more important to investigate history and learn more about various histories to influence my practice than it was to do something like an MFA. So I have undergraduate degrees in Spanish and studio art, as well as Latin American studies, and a master's in Latin American studies, and then a PhD in the history of art, which looks at in arts of the Americas. Right now I have 2 books which are under contract. One is on Chicano art and the concept of Aztlán within post-1968 art, activist art, Chicano meaning Mexican-American art, and the other one is looking at indigenous aesthetics from an activist perspective. So the way that Native artists are in the here and now using art as a way to create a space for tribal sovereignty, so what we could call national sovereignty within the indigenous, or as people say kind of in other places, in the Aboriginal context. So my work is about investigating local histories, investigating often marginalized or forgotten histories, and ways of thinking about those things, or using art to think about those things. So, although I started off primarily as a printmaker, I've kind of gone more and more afield from that. And while I'm still making prints and still very interested in graphic works in printed form, I'm just as excited about collaborations and seeing what I can do when working with people. So right now I teach at Michigan State University. I teach in what's called the Residential College of the Arts and Humanities, and I teach a variety of different courses. A freshman seminar called Art Activism, and an arts-based course called Art and Social Justice. So my work really is interested in those relationships. I'm part of a print collective called Just Seeds. And Just Seeds is a collaboration of just over 20 artists in the US, Canada, and Mexico who are all printmakers who kind of came up in radical political circles. Kind of, in many ways, many of us grew up in punk rock and were interested in the do-it-yourself aesthetic, doing zines and organizing shows and that sort of thing. So my own aesthetic and my own interest in art is very much influenced by growing up in early to mid-90s hardcore music, in straight edge, and those sorts of circles, if that makes any sense to you. So I made zines, and even today, part of my artistic practice, I just, there's some on the shelf over here, for a show at Galeria America, which is at the University of Notre Dame, I put together this I don't know, 24-page or maybe a little more, zine comic, based on some comics I had done for a book that was scripted by Harvey Pekar in, I think it came out in 09 or 2010. And so it tells two different stories that Pekar scripted the narrative, but it's based on, if anyone's familiar with Studs Terkel's working. Studs Terkel was a Chicago-based journalist, and so through the work of Paul Buell, he organized a bunch of artists to turn working into a graphic novel. And so one of these chapters that I did was in the actual book, and the other never saw the light of day. And so for the show in Notre Dame, I decided to make this comic zine in a limited edition of 50. And from that DIY aesthetic, I've always liked to use reclaimed and reused materials. It fits within my political as well as aesthetic practice. And so for these, and I guess I'll talk about, before we actually watch the video, I'll talk a little bit about my print practice. So for these, maybe 10 years ago, I started using used grocery bags. I just, it was at a time before grocery bags had gone to plastic, and I'd go to the grocery store. It was before people were using cotton or hemp bags to get your groceries. And so I just had dozens and dozens of grocery bags under my sink in the kitchen, and I just started making my relief prints out there. And so I've continued that. And so if you kind of open these up, you can see that the logo from this is from a kind of Midwestern or Great Lakes chain called Meijer, which is a box store, but thankfully at least they have union labor. So I started, 10 or so years ago making print works on bags, and that's kind of where I started coming into my own, or feeling that I really had understood what I was doing as an artist, right? I think because when we're in school, we respond to works that are assignments, and then you finish school and you just start, sometimes you're just kind of out there floating. What do I make? I don't have any requirements. What do I do? And so I started making, I was involved in the late 90s and early 2000s with a group called the Industrial Workers of the World. And the IWW, or WWEs, are founded in the early 20th century, a radical labor union, still around organizing workers at Starbucks and the such. But I was doing some graphics for them and some organizing work for them. And for the 100th anniversary, there were a bunch of different cultural events around the world, and I put together a series of prints based off the songs of Joe Hill. And Joe Hill was kind of a labor organizer, was killed in the state of Utah. He was tried and found guilty of murder. Although, if anyone reads the New York Times, there's a couple of books out that actually say that he was in fact innocent. So I made a series of prints, and as you can see, on these grocery bags, based on the songs that Joe Hill wrote. And aesthetically, my interest has always been in very kind of raw images, very flat colors, and very simple uses of colors, right? And so for a long time, I was doing works that were all red and black. If you know kind of the history of the labor movement, or even like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right? There's always, with kind of leftist politics, there's always oftentimes its association with red and black. So those had some sort of kind of semiotic meaning in the way that I was thinking and working. And so this is, just to tell you a little about these images, and I'll leave them up here if you want to look at them. This was for the 100th anniversary. This is an image of Joe Hill over here. And this is an image of Ricardo Flores Magón, who was a Mexican anarchist around the time of the Mexican Revolution, helped start the PLM, which is a radical organization in Mexico. This is a print that's based off a comic in the early 20th centuries by an individual named Bingo. And so I turned it into a print. This was on the back cover of a book that came out on Verso, which I contributed some other illustrations to, but this was used as the back cover illustration for that. It just shows this group of various workers kind of collectively putting their power together into the fist. Very, very simple cuts, right? I'm oftentimes using just little pieces of linoleum or found pieces of wood, just, drawing and attacking them within, you know, a few hours and I'm done. And I think part of that, I started working really small. You can look at these are all really small. I have a short attention span, like many of you. As artists, sometimes we probably have ADD or some other unverifiable form of that. And so me being able to focus on something, it was like I had 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and then my brain was somewhere else. So working small allowed me to, right, throw myself in and then be like, okay, I'm out. I'm doing something else. And I've been able to, as I get older, focus slightly longer. Right? This is a week-long installation project, and then basically it's over. Right? I've been, you know, it's a little disingenuous to say that because I've been thinking about this and doing research for the past 12 to 18 months. But right, it's really kind of in the happening, one solid crazy week, and then you know it's on to another project. So as artists, I think you need to think about that. How do you work once you're out of school? How are you going to find time? You know, what ways do projects fit and work together? And I don't know if people know the work of Harold Fletcher. He runs the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State University. But he kind of popularized the notion of art and social practice, talking about the way that, you know, once you get out of school, many of us as artists don't simply go into the studio and work. That, in fact, it's in collaborations, in community projects, in various other things where art, you know, in 2011, 2012 really exists. And as an activist, as someone who's always been kind of trying to couple those things, I've been drawn to thinking about this idea of art as social practice, where art, which is a privileged position, right? I think of myself as very privileged, right? And I think those of you that are artists or studying to be artists, however you identify, right? Think of what you do as a very privileged position. A friend of mine, John Hunter, who's an Aboriginal Australian dude, I've done some collaborations with him, and one of the things that he shared with me, which he learned from his elders, was that knowledge is in some ways it's a burden, right? When you know something, you have the responsibility to then share it, right? So as artists, I've always kind of seen myself in that. Not in that what I have is somehow a burden, but in fact it's my responsibility if I have some sort of knowledge that I have to share, right? And through collaborative projects, I think we can do that, right? We can share ideas, we can develop things together in conversation and in dialogue. So just some of the other prints I have in my hand. This is an image of Emma Goldman, if anyone's familiar with Emma's work. Another recent book is about her. This was an image based off a print by Posada, who's a famous Mexican printmaker, but taking it into the contemporary, which was looking at some anti-immigration regulations that were going through the House a few years ago, right? Looking at this figure kind of as the INS, or what was the INS in the ICE, right? Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So my work is looking at history, it's looking at other artists. If I learned nothing else in art school, I went to art school for a year and then dropped out. I could do some other things and then went back to university. But if I learned nothing else in art school, is that all art is about other art. So pay attention in those art history classes, because in fact you'll realize that the best art is art that is